Hello and welcome to day one of the TRT World Forum. I'm Rachael Ruble, here to moderate this discussion on climate and global health crises as a strategic threat. Fires, floods, pollution, heat waves, and more severe storms. The effects of climate change are visible in the increasing frequency of extreme weather around the globe. These unprecedented events lead to untold costs on people's lives, livelihoods, and health. As the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to reverberate and the full scale of the human and economic costs is becoming apparent, the delicate and intricate link between our environment, economic security, and health is more obvious than ever. Supply chain disruptions, damage to economies, and the threat of another potentially worse pandemic have put infectious diseases front and center on the global threat radar. We've seen and heard the dire warnings to curb our behaviors, and yet our behaviors largely remain unchanged. Now, with the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, coming up amid the warning of adapt or die, what can governments do to finally respond to the threat posed by climate inaction? What can be done to manage public health crises and the long-term impacts of climate change while mitigating short-term economic costs? Joining me now to discuss this are Nick Bridge, the UK Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change, Dr. Maria Neira, Director of the Department of Public Health and Environment for the World Health Organization, Dr. John Nkengasong, Director for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Alexander Verbeek, a Dutch environmentalist, writer, public speaker, diplomat, and former strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jonathan Patz, Director of the Global Health Institute, and Robert O. Keohane, Emeritus Professor of International Affairs at Princeton University. Thank you all and welcome. Thank you for joining us here at the TRT World Forum. Dr. Neira, I want to start with you first, as you're the Director of the Department of Public Health and Environment at the World Health Organization. So let's start with the obvious. What needs to be done to improve the response to climate action? Okay, unfortunately, we are having some audio problems with our guest, Dr. Neira. It sounds like her microphone is muted, so I'll move on.
Can you hear me now?
One of my other guests while we get that problem fixed out. Nick Bridge, I'll go to you next. I know that your time with us is limited today. You're going to be leaving us after just an hour, and I do want to ask about the UK's Environment Agency, which recently issued a stark warning about climate change, saying adapt or die. Is this an admission that we're beyond the point of no return, that we're no longer looking at reversing climate change, but rather living with it and adapting to survive it?
Not at all. We're doing both. We're absolutely fully committed to both dramatically reducing emissions in the next 10 years. We need to almost halve emissions, and that's a huge focus of COP26. But as you say, a second aspect is to accept that we are already a long way along this path, and we need to also give more attention to adapting and being resilient. And so we have the chance 5 or 6 years after the Paris Agreement, that historic agreement of governments, to come together in Glasgow at COP and hugely increase those commitments to reduce emissions, increase the finance and the cooperation and support, especially to the poorest and most vulnerable countries that are feeling this the worst and the most, and to make sure that we are keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, keeping it possible, because the consequences otherwise are absolutely catastrophic. So in partnership with our COP presidency partner, Italy, and with a huge number of world leaders coming to Glasgow to support and guide their negotiators, we're just determined to do everything we can as hosts, with Turkey and many other important partners, to do everything we can to reach those goals and do what people around the world want us to do. And we'll come on to this discussion more, but the basic headline for me is that this is an absolutely critical risk, but if we tackle it together, it becomes an opportunity for our health, for our economy, and for our environment.
Okay, that's certainly some encouraging words to start things off. Let's go back to Dr. Neira. I hope we have our audio issues with you straightened out. So what needs to be done to improve the response to climate change?
Let me start with this positive message as well. I think we need to make COP26 successful. I think it will be important that everybody understand that in addition to what climate change is doing to our environment, to our planet, this is affecting very much, very negatively our health. And to keep it positive, if we tackle the causes of climate change, we could obtain enormous health benefits, most of them coming from a reduction on air pollution. And as you know, exposure to air pollution today is causing the death of more than 7 million people every year. So that's an enormous price. So we think that the moment people will understand that this is urgent, it's affecting their health, this can be the motivation or the push for finally accelerate this agenda and hopefully making sure that the benefits will be enormous for our society, our health, our economy. And we could reduce those deaths caused by air pollution. We could reduce deaths caused by unhealthy diets. We could reduce deaths and morbidity caused by lack of exercise, physical activity in our cities. There are so many positive things that can be obtained if we tackle the causes of climate change, if we stop particularly the combustion of fossil fuels, and if we stop polluting everything we touch, our food, our water, and the air we breathe. I think will be very positive, but we need to take massive decisions in the name of our health.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like an uphill battle. Professor Keohane, we've seen the dramatic effects of climate change already. It seems like it gets worse and worse every year with wildfires. We had terrible wildfires here in Turkey over the summer, in California, every year in Canada and in Europe as well. We're seeing massive storms. It does seem in many ways that it is all hopeless. Do you think that we have passed the point of no return, or do you agree with the other guests that there is hope that we still can turn this around?
No, we have not past the point of no return. I agree entirely with the two previous speakers. There are some very extensive reports out in the last year about the U.S. economy, quite detailed, which show that we can decarbonize the economy entirely by 2050 at very little net economic cost. There's huge investments required now, as the speaker said. We have to act right away. We can't wait and delay. But those investments, which can be made with low interest rates now, will pay themselves back over this period of time. So the net cost is virtually zero, according to the National Academy of Sciences. So yes, we can act, but the issue is the political will to act, not the question, not the issue of it being too late or being too expensive.
Jonathan Patz, in your opinion, as the director of the Global Health Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, what's the relationship between climate change and health? Is this a relationship that's the same worldwide, regardless of the wealth disparities that we see?
Well, you know, health is at the center of our concern over climate change. Too long, we've just thought of this as an environmental issue and worried about polar bears, but you know, there are so many pathways through which climate affects our health. Obviously, the direct effects of heat waves and wildfires, but also malnutrition, insect-borne diseases that are very sensitive to subtle shifts in climate, so mosquito-borne diseases, tick-borne diseases, and of course, malnutrition is a huge area. So there are so many pathways through which climate affects our health. It's why we view this as one of our greatest environmental health challenges of our times. As far as who will suffer and where, certainly poor countries may suffer the consequences early on. But as we've learned from the COVID pandemic, an increase in risk of disease anywhere in the world affects us everywhere in our globalized economy. So, low-lying deltas in Bangladesh may be more prone to flooding than places in the Netherlands that have adequate um, uh, adaptation capacity. But this is something where there's definitely there are we affected, but we're all affected, and why it's got to be a concerted effort to fight this problem, which is absolutely a health challenge.
Yeah, it certainly is. I want to move now to Dr. John Nkengasong, Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Doctor, what have you seen in Africa? Has climate change been a driver of health inequality within the continent? And if so, what steps are African countries taking to mitigate this impact?
No, thank you. And first of all, let me appreciate for you for having included me as part of this conversation. I think others have said it so nicely that climate change is real. We are no longer in that debate at all. And then the second thing I would like to say is that we are in this together. As I believe Jonathan just mentioned, those of us in developing part of the world risk having the blunt of the effect of climate change in several areas, including, as he rightly mentioned, the whole spectrum of the impact on diseases. And we are beginning to see that anyway. I think as an anecdote, there are rivers or that when I grew up as a child, I saw them. And now, when I go back to the same locations, those rivers do not exist anymore, and you can very clearly see the impact of what it means in the local health of the people around there. I think it is Robert who talked about political will, the need for political will to address this. I'll take you one step further and say it is important to look at political will, which is extremely important in this, but political commitment to do something with this, with what we know, is very important. There's a lot of what are characterized as the known do-nothing gaps that can truly be achieved. But we have to build trust. My fear, very honestly speaking with you, is that that trust capital that we needed as humanity to address climate change issues, bigger issues like this, is being eroded because of the inequities that we are going through with the COVID pandemic, the inequities in access to commodities, the inequities in access to vaccines. I've really weakened the trust factor that will be extremely important in addressing the climate change issues, that which, as I said earlier in my submission, we are in this together. So as a continent, we are looking at this very carefully. And of course, our political leadership is taking it very seriously, but it has to be a collective. It has to be the whole of society that we look at this and say, this is a serious threat. It is a threat that, if not addressed now and addressed properly, will pay, the next generations will pay dearly for the harm that we are creating today. So as a continent that is suffering, or that stands to suffer most from this, we are pleading actually that we should translate political will into political commitment.
Let me move now to Alexander Verbeek. As an environmentalist and former strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, do you think increases in global economic growth and equity have contributed to environmental degradation? And if so, is it at all avoidable?
Yes, clearly. There's no doubt that there's a direct link between the rapid economic growth that we've seen in the past 200 years and certainly in the past decades, and the problems of climate change and loss of nature. That's for the simple reason that if you measure economic growth by a higher GDP, that is normally achieved by more use of energy and natural resources, and still, even today, still about 80% of the energy mix is based on fossil fuels. So, and on top of that, if we get richer, we also want to consume more. So we buy all kinds of products. Probably all of us have used something with palm oil before we are even sitting down and talk to each other today, or several products with palm oil. We've used our iPhones today. Some of you have eaten meat today. All those kind of luxury spending is another factor. So we can't continue with aiming for economic growth that is based on fossil fuels for all the reasons that all the speakers just mentioned. And I agree with everything I've heard so far. Only last year, the worldwide damages by all natural disasters, and most of them were linked to climate change, were more than $200 billion. So we have to change course rapidly, and you can do that in two ways. You can either say we promote degrowth, so let's say negative growth, because you can't. Let's say what the Club of Rome said half a century ago. You can't keep everything growing on a planet that is not growing, and so we need better lives and not richer lives. And a lot of the comments I heard already were about that. If you eat more healthy, it's better for the planet and better for yourself. Those kind of things. If you move more, let's say on your bicycle instead of using the car, that's also better. So, and on the other hand, they're the believers in green growth. Politicians love it because, on the one hand, to the environmentalist, you can say it's green, and for those that are worried about economic growth, you can say there's still growth, and that is the path that most governments prefer. So you can still grow the economy, but should not be at the cost of ruining the climate and biodiversity. And to achieve that, you need to decouple the linkage between more pollution created by using energy, but still having growth. And we already see that. It's now about 2% per year, but it has to grow until about 9%. So we have to do that. If you look at the European Union, we have to be 5 times as good in breaking this linkage. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I see this as also, as was said before, as a huge opportunity.
You make some excellent points about changes in our lifestyle, and I want to get back to that in just a moment. But first, I want to go back to Dr. Neira, because the WHO has released a report ahead of COP26, and in it you've said that bringing down air pollution to WHO guideline levels would reduce the total number of global deaths from air pollution by 80%, while dramatically reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that fuel climate change, and a shift to more nutritious plant-based diets in line with WHO recommendations could reduce global emissions significantly, ensure more resilient food systems, and avoid up to 5.1 million diet-related deaths a year by 2050. This sounds great, but how can these goals be achieved?
I think by telling people how this is affecting their health, I think health can be a very, very strong driving force on this agenda. We have been talking about environment and climate change for 26 years. We are in COP26, but we have not been talking about what this is doing to our health. So it's probably COP1 in terms of having the health argument so much presented at this COP, and with the strong arguments that you just presented. I mean, if we say how many lives you can save from a healthier diet, from stopping the combustion of fossil fuels and reducing air pollution, with all the lack of well-being and loss of healthy lives that represent as well, and the cost, because at the moment governments are still giving subsidies to fossil fuels, the amount of 400 billions. But they forgot a little detail. They didn't calculate the externalities of that. Means the cost for the health system of treating those diseases caused by exposure to the combustion of those fossil fuels. And that represents 5 trillion every year. So even on economic terms, we have very strong arguments here. I think that the health community is less patient probably than the environmental community. So if we join forces here and we present our arguments in a very positive and transformative way, we have to do 3 transformations. The urban planning, we need a healthy urban planning. We need a transformation in our sources of energy, so a healthy energy transition. And we need a transition as well on our food production. It has to be more sustainable. If we have these three ones, if we stop to pay subsidies to fossil fuels, and we quantify regularly the benefits that this is generating for my lungs, my health, my children right now. As Jonathan was saying, sometimes we have been focusing on the future and on the polar bears and on the planet. If now we told to people about their lungs, maybe this will give this type of acceleration that we all need. Our report for COP26 is called The Health Argument for Climate Action, and we have healthy prescriptions that we think can support this agenda and accelerate it, and going along with all the arguments that you have presented about how this will benefit our economy, our health, our development, and our growth as well. A different one, different lifestyles as well, but with incredible and positive benefits for our health. Of course, we need to adapt as well, because some people like the African continent and others that they didn't cause as much this global warming are already paying the consequences. So adaptation needs to go as well in this equation.
Professor Keohane, did you want to jump in there?
Yes, I'd like to. Thank you. I want to talk about the politics for a minute, because I agree with Alexander that we have to decouple economic growth from fossil fuels. But we're not going to stop economic growth because developing countries need it, for example. We can't tell Africa or India that they have to keep living at their current levels while the rich countries live at a much higher level. So we're going to have to, it's not going to work to follow the Club of Rome recommendation to reduce economic growth or make it negative. I don't think that'll fly politically anywhere in rich or poor countries. We need to decouple economic growth from fossil fuels, which is now possible given the energy revolution. Solar costs are down 90% in the last decade. Wind costs are down 70%. Battery costs are down 85%. The technology is working our way. The politics has not been working our way, but the technology is. But at home, we have a political issue which we don't often address. There are concentrated economic interests in the fossil fuel industry that are actively working to deceive people about climate change and to maintain a fossil fuel economy. They have to be attacked. This is not going to be just doing nice things like riding your bike. It's going to be going after the oil companies and the private equity companies that are taking over oil company assets and exploiting them. So it's going to be a political fight, and it's not just going to be nice talk. And we're going to have to engage in that political fight the way the fight was engaged in against big tobacco, which was fighting, as everybody knows here, smoking regulations, and which only could be attacked by actually demonizing it. We're going to have to really go after the fossil fuel interests.
Yeah, Professor Keohane, you make an excellent point there about the politics involved with climate change in America. But what I'm wondering, though, is how do countries manage geopolitical relationships with climate change on an international level? For example, China is one of the biggest polluters in the world. They're heavily dependent on coal, but even though they've promised to cut down on coal consumption, they've actually increased their use of coal recently because they're facing an energy crisis. How do countries manage that kind of relationship when already it's a bit of a hostile relationship, to say the least, between the U.S. and China, for example?
I think the U.S. has to work with China on climate change, and the U.S. of course is going to push back on China on a number of other issues, but it shouldn't demonize the Chinese, and it shouldn't make everything about geopolitical competition. China, let's say, has a huge stake in this. It's not that China is not affected by climate change. It's a huge loser from climate change, and so China has a major self-interest in acting on climate change. So China does not respond well to being preached to or being told they're the problem. Actually, many of those goods that are generating pollution are sent to the developed countries, and perhaps the developed countries should be given the discredit for the environmental effects as well as China. There has to be a tough process of engaging with China, recognizing that we are part of the problem, not moralizing toward the Chinese, and trying to compartmentalize relationships that are difficult and tense with relationships like climate change, where we have a strong common interest.
Alexander Verbeek, I want to get back to you and the points you were making earlier about the luxuries that we have in our lives that are contributing to climate change. For example, eating meat, because you've once said that the high demand for meat is responsible for wildfires, and this, along with many other risk factors are associated with current lifestyles, is harming our environment. How do we create the political and social will for people to make changes?
Yes, well, first, briefly going back to what Professor Keohane just said, to be perfectly clear there, I fully agree every single word that he said, and it's true that we need economic growth in places like large areas in Africa, for instance, where growth is still needed. On the other hand, we have luxuries in the West. Meat is one of them. But also think about all these cruise ships or people flying to the sun 4 times a year in airlines that have actually been subsidized by their own taxpayers' money. So we subsidize often things at government level, including a lot of luxuries that we don't really need, whereas there's other people in the world that badly need not luxuries, but just the basic conditions of life. So inequality was already mentioned. That is something that is very closely related to anything when we talk about climate change. So when we talk about meat, I'm not sure in what formulation I used. It's not that all wildfires are caused by eating meat, but yes, there are clear linkages. There are many causes, of course, but high demand for meat is one of the major causes for all the wildfires that you see in the Amazon rainforest. There's 3 times as many fires in beef producing zones than in the zones in the Amazon where beef is not produced. So I would love to see more action on meat, and I think it should start with changing the subsidy culture. So if you look, for instance, at the United States, the US government gives more than 100 times more subsidies on meat and products that are needed to produce meat than they give on vegetables and on fruit, which would be much better for your health. So it's another example, just like subsidizing fossil fuels, which we do worldwide, according to ARENA, 20 times as much as we subsidize renewable energy. It's another example where governments worldwide, I just pick on the US here, but you see it in many places, governments are subsidizing the wrong thing. So when we look at solutions, we have to very much look at the role of governments. Governments, in all their wide variety of systems that we have in the world, generally have not been doing a good job in the past few decades to get us out of this mess of the climate crisis and the nature crisis and the pollution crisis that we are in. Thanks.
Let me get back to Nick Bridge. You're the UK Special Representative for Climate Change. What's the importance of the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development offices working closely with their foreign counterparts to counter the negative impact of climate change?
Well, we were proud to be the first country to properly establish a climate diplomacy network. All around the world, our diplomats are focused on climate change, environment, as well as energy and health and all the other issues we're discussing, because we have to think about our diplomacy in the 21st century in this fashion, the interdependencies and the complexities. And now this is the biggest threat we collectively face. And so our diplomacy is absolutely critical as a community of nations. And that's why the Paris Agreement, we need to reinforce it. We need to show that it's working. I want to just pick up on something that was said earlier about what China should do and what the United States should do. The structure of the climate change agreement of the UN is that every country can set out its contribution in its own interest and in the collective interest. And this is where, as Professor Keohane Keohane set out very clearly, it's in everyone's environmental, economic, social, and as Maria said, very much health interests to act. Now that's new since Paris. You know, in the Paris Agreement, we took a political commitment that climate change was real and going to be catastrophic, but we now have the economic, absolutely irrefutable evidence that it makes sense on that level also for businesses and for governments to move forward very, very, very quickly together to decarbonize. So it's now about the diplomacy that gets countries together and that they can agree and share the understanding that it's in all of our interests. I think we have a particular responsibility to the poorest and most vulnerable countries, because those are not the countries that caused the problem originally or who are set to produce emissions in the future. So the G20 has a particular responsibility, and already the G7 has established commitments that put it on that 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory that I mentioned. So the diplomacy around COP is to get together as countries, make those commitments that get us on a pathway to net zero, and do as much of that as possible in the next 10 years. But also, alongside those country commitments, we have governments at the state level, at the city level, and businesses of all kinds also going on the net zero trajectory. So for people in their real lives, this becomes something real, and they can see that we're doing what we need to do to tackle it. The only additional point I would make to the sort of growth debate is actually, you know, I think it is important to give more emphasis maybe than we have done in recent decades to our standards of living and our quality of life. And health is a great example. You know, immunizing populations and giving basic health care is a huge increase in people's standard of living, more than some of the material consumption. The quality is what matters. Are we producing our economic activity sustainably going forward, which we have absolutely not been doing in the past? So I say that these climate risks and these health risks are the biggest risks we face, but they become an opportunity if we tackle it in a thoughtful and a holistic way as a community of nations, and that's what COP is all about.
Professor Keohane, I saw you raise your hand. Did you have something else you wanted to add?
Thanks. Just very briefly, I agree entirely. I just want to point out that the Paris Accord was a major innovation because, unlike Kyoto, which told countries what they should do and gave them quotas which they didn't follow, Paris gave countries the opportunity to define what their own interests were, their nationally defined contributions, and therefore they got ownership of that. And then the issue is transparency and monitoring and urging countries to actually meet their commitments and expand the commitments. But it's their commitment, not somebody else imposing on them. That's the only way it's going to work in world politics. So I agree with what Mr. Bridges said entirely.
And let me get back to you, Nick, about the Paris Agreement, because Turkey ratified the Paris Agreement in October 2021, just this month. How do you envision cooperation between the UK and Turkey in addressing climate change?
Well, that was an extremely welcome announcement by President Erdogan to ratify Paris, but also to make a commitment to carbon neutrality by 2053. So those are very significant steps. Turkey is an extremely important economy, including in its ability to do low carbon and soon zero carbon manufacturing. The European nations have very positive and ambitious green policies now and investment strategies. And it's incredibly exciting to see how the Turkish economy can support that transition in its own interest and for its own jobs and the quality of life and air quality and environmental quality, but also feed into what's happening around the world, and particularly in Europe with this green transition that is at the heart of Europe's identity now. So the UK is absolutely committed to that relationship and to supporting that transition. Turkey's doing a lot already and will now be doing a lot more now that it's set that long-term target and given the certainty to its businesses that this is the pathway, the energy system system can change for the better, the food system, the way of moving around, the transportation, all of these things can now change for the better, and that is a very attractive proposition. I think as we approach COP and I'm looking at our diplomacy, our biggest problem is urgency and scale. Everyone's got to act, and everyone's got to act faster than they're doing currently.
Jonathan Patz, you gave a TEDx talk a few years ago. I watched it. It was very inspiring on climate change. And you said that it is one of the world's greatest ethical dilemmas. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, as I said earlier, those countries most vulnerable to the risk of climate change, as far as health is concerned, are the ones that are least responsible for causing the problem. So that's a huge ethical dilemma. And if I just pick up on some of the previous comments, that we have a chance to solve this dilemma by acting on climate change, because it absolutely is a health crisis. And just echoing what Dr. Neira pointed out, that to act on this challenge, right, offers enormous opportunities. A recent report came out showing that if the 9 countries that create 1/2 of that are heating the planet, if they were to meet the Paris Agreement in reducing their emissions, that would save over 10 million lives a year. We're talking about, close to, actually, if you were to look at emissions across energy, food sector, and transportation, and get to low carbon across those 3 sectors, from cleaner air, healthier food, and more walkable and bikeable cities, that would save nearly 1/2 of premature deaths that occur every year. So, on the one hand, we have an opportunity to act and solve this ethical challenge, because of those most suffering are the least responsible for causing the problem, especially when you look at places like small island countries that will be underwater because of the emissions that the industrialized world is putting into the air. But that this is a golden opportunity, and more important, for this COP26, and as the World Health Organization has established, this should be the health conference of the parties on climate change. When people recognize that climate change absolutely is a health issue, that there should be more common ground, we need to, it should change the playing field. And especially when we talk about, sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you.
This incredible, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one other thing that came up about the Agency for Renewable Energy published a report that we're in a different time now. The cheapest way to generate electricity is from renewables and batteries. So when we talk about politics and decreasing coal, we're in a different technology now, where the answer is, we're not waiting for a miracle, that the technology is there. We just need the political will to act and to benefit from a clean energy solution, as well as cities designed for people, not just for the private automobile. This is just an unbelievable time, a huge opportunity for health by going to a low carbon society.
Dr. Nkengasong, as we just heard from Jonathan there, those most vulnerable to climate change are often those least responsible for it. And as you well know, Africa does hardly contribute to climate change, yet sees many of the effects from it. What options and tools are available for countries on the continent as they see these worsening effects?
I think, as everyone else has discussed here, this is not longer an issue of a country or a region. I would say there is a need to recognize that we are in this together, and that whether Africa is a cause of it or takes a blunt or the short end of this, we are in together. So I think that means we have to act now. We have to act differently and act collectively. I think it's very important that the Paris Agreement, those that were actually whatever we agreed in Paris, and especially enabling and supporting developing countries in Africa to cope with this, the effect of that is very important, because there's absolutely no way that the countries in Africa or most parts of the developing world will come to the table without some understanding, mutual understanding of how this is going to balance. There's going to be a balance between the development and the impact that is going to, climate change is going to have on the environment. So I think we need that strong political understanding from a global level that those elements that were captured in the Paris Agreement must be fulfilled. I think that without that, I think my take is that it will continue to be a challenge for the implementation. We can agree on all levels of political pronouncements, political declarations, but we need to move into actions that would enable us to truly listen to what the challenges from the developing countries are, the challenges in countries in Africa in implementing those very important elements and ingredients that were agreed on during the Paris Agreement. So as a continent, the effects are already there. The dramatic changes are happening on the continent. They have serious implications for health, and the continent cannot address it by itself. I mean, it needs partnership, it needs coordination, it needs collaboration with the rest of the world. So I think that the most dialogue that have happened across the continent speaks to that understanding, the understanding that we create, this is a problem that we didn't bring upon ourselves, but at the same time, this is not a problem that we cannot be indifferent, that we have to be actors in this and central to finding the solutions going forward.
Dr. Neira, the WHO report that came out in the run-up to COP26 also calls for action to prevent and prepare for the next pandemic, to commit to vaccine equality and address inequalities at the root of the current climate and health crises. As we've seen with this current pandemic of wealthy nations hoarding vaccines, offering third doses and boosters to their own citizens before poorer countries even have access to a single shot. What's the solution to this inequality and everyone out for themselves mentality that we've seen in this last almost 2 years now with this pandemic?
I think this is a very basic public health agenda. If we are now moving on those trends that were described before on renewable sources of energy, healthy diets, and different ways of mobility and transport and the way we do our cities, I think most of those inequities can be corrected as well. If we stop this aggressive deforestation and aggressive agricultural practices, I think we will be able to prevent at the source most of the causes of this potential nest causes for other outbreaks or other crises. I think it's all about public health, and where we have the opportunity here. When I was listening to the doctor from CDC, my pleasure to meet you, I was thinking when I was a very young physician in Africa myself, I was at the healthcare facilities with a kerosene lamp helping a woman to deliver, for instance. While today, in my garden in Geneva, which is not the most, with sunny place in the world, every evening I can have a little lamp, and it costs nothing. It's a very cheap device that you can buy almost everywhere. And if you have it under the sun during the day, during the night, you will have light. So sometimes these so-called technologies is a question of political willingness. It's about recognizing that universal health coverage is a right, that the basic services in terms of public health and healthcare is a right as well. And maybe this concept that if an infectious disease is starting one place, as we saw it now during the pandemic, we are all very vulnerable. The question now is how we reduce this vulnerability, how we do it on a very fair and equitable way, how we, in this transition to new sources of energy, we don't make the poor and those who need a very old car, the cars that are polluting everywhere, we need them to be part of this transition and not paying the price for this transition. So it will be very important to make sure that this is not just a benefit in the rich countries, but we take on board everyone. And that will contribute as well to put pressure on governments, because if we have all type of citizens, from middle class, from a low economic class, recognizing that this is beneficial for them as well, they will put a lot of pressure on their politicians for executing the Paris Treaty. At the moment, only few people knows what it is on the public on the Paris Treaty, and we need to make sure that we popularize this. We make sure that everybody will see benefits for them, and they will see that they will have a sustainable public transport system in case they cannot keep using a very old car that is very polluting, or if they live outside the city, they will have possibilities for commuting and not paying higher prices for the fuels that they are using, or the food that they are consuming, which is more expensive if it's more healthy. And fruits and vegetables sometimes are cheaper than processed food that other ways are. So these economic adjustments, they need to be taken in consideration as well, and bringing that population, the middle and low class on board, and not just those who are already converted. I think it will be very important to create that political willingness and accelerate those decisions that needs to be taken, and protect in this way the health of the people.
Dr. Nkengasong, you spoke earlier about the inequity of the COVID pandemic, what you've seen in Africa. Over 5.7 billion coronavirus vaccine doses have been administered globally, but only 2% have been given in Africa. What systemic factors have contributed to this gross inequity, and what can be done to fix it?
I'm happy you raised that, because when the pandemic started, we said all the right things. And we talked about the need for rapid access to vaccines. We talked about equity, but those pronouncements never translated into action. And unfortunately, the continent finds itself where it is. And I say that because that kind of a behavior that we witnessed and have witnessed, continue to witness during this pandemic, will affect the way in which we sit around the table to discuss issues around climate change. We were told that we need to follow through with what the multilateral mechanisms were put forward to do. That is the COVAX facility. And as a continent, we believe in that. I mean, that's why I started off this discussion by saying that the trust factor has been eroded significantly. There's total distrust between countries in Africa, believing what the multilateral systems put in place. So we really have to step back and take a look at the multilateralism that has guided us since 1947, and ask ourselves the question if there's no room for improvement, and to building that trust. There, without that trust factor, there, I think it becomes very, very difficult. Science has served us incredibly well during this pandemic. No one could have imagined that within 1 year we'll have a vaccine that goes through clinical trials and get into the arms of people. No one would have believed that we would be able to have diagnostics that quickly. It took us several years to have an appropriate diagnostic test for HIV, but here we are. So if you bring the people that fought the 1918 pandemic here today, they will look at us with total, they will be very pleased to see us. They will admire us. But at the same time, they'll be shocked by our behaviors, that how our behavior has actually contributed and is going to contribute to a very sustained pandemic, because If we do not eliminate this virus in Africa and most part of the world that are lacking in vaccines, there is no way that we can claim that we would have defeated this pandemic. I think we all know how these variants have emerged. So I think that is extremely important. How is this related to the climate change discussion is the trust capital that I keep coming on, that we have to make sure that the geopolitics is limited as much as possible, that there are certain things that must be recognized as common interests, and we keep geopolitics aside and address those. Secondly, that we must look at multilateralism that has governed us since 1947 and say, how are there any areas that needs to be strengthened? Should we reset a button and look at it again critically so that we can rebuild this trust capital that is going to be fundamental in moving us forward in addressing big issues like the climate change?
Nick Bridge, I know you have to leave us in about 2 minutes, so I wanted to throw one last question at you if you have the time. With the UN Climate Conference coming up starting at the end of this month, what role do multilateral organizations such as the UN and IMF have in managing climate change, and what particular impact of climate change should they be prioritizing?
Thank you, and apologies about having to leave. The multilateral organizations and the international financial institutions have an absolutely central and critical role to play. They have global reach, they have a lot of finance, but the big thing is that they send the signal that the rest of the global financial system can build on. So if we can get all the multilateral development banks climate proofed with all of their capital aligned with positive solutions, clean solutions, not all of it directly about resilience, climate adaptation, climate investment, but everything they do being consistent with this pathway, then that is huge because it triggers blended finance, but it triggers then the $200 trillion of finance in our global economic system into pivoting into the right kind of investments. So the multilateral development banks have a really critical role to play. There is some very strong leadership that has come through in recent years at the top of these organizations, and countries form the boards of these organizations. So the countries have now to step up and give that strategic and political direction. And I want to also I don't want to finish without fully supporting everything that John has been saying about trust, because this is at the heart of what we need to do in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time. Every country will come with a different perspective, a different set of voices back home, but with a common interest. We've heard that the big polluting countries have caused this problem. The African nations, as John said, have caused about 3% of the emissions. That will remain a very low number going forward. And we have to acknowledge humbly what we have done in our economic pathway and what we need to do differently going forward. Acknowledge the different burdens that are already being shared disproportionately by those more vulnerable and poor communities, and also about the future generations. And John said, that we said all the right things during the pandemic, and we see the differential distribution of vaccines, and we're saying the right things now on climate, but we really have to make sure that the actions are taken where they need to be taken, and the G20 nations really need to lead that effort in the run-up to COP and have some give and some take, because as Robert said at the beginning, this makes absolute sense on political and economic grounds. And in fact, that is not even pricing in all the catastrophic and quite unquantifiable risks that we don't fully understand. If you add that in, it really is crazy not to be doing this faster and at scale, but we need to bring people with us and help the transition process. So we'll definitely look to WHO and all of the other colleagues as we bring health to the fore of this agenda. I just, there are some hugely helpful content that we've all been talking about. And if listeners want to look up the Lancet Countdown, LANCET, or the Wellcome Trust, Our People, Our Planet, we have hundreds of pages of wonderful evidence. You can use it in schools, with children, with communities, to show that the health and climate agenda needs to be seen together and to be tackled in a holistic way. So thank you for this opportunity once again to TRT.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us and making some excellent points there. Nick Bridge, UK Foreign Secretary, Special Representative for Climate Change, and we'll let you go now. Thank you so much. Jonathan, Patz, I want to go back to you because you've mentioned a couple times, and we also heard Dr. Neira mention the polar bear. We've all seen that heartbreaking image of the polar bear that's starving up, in the north. And you mentioned this in your TEDx talk as well about everyone thinks that's a very sad image, but at the same time, it seems very far away. Talk to us about that polar bear effect, and is it almost a disadvantage to the climate change because it does seem very far away?
Yes, I do think that it has been something that people have been. Certainly, we care about nature, and biodiversity is very important for health. But as far as a poster child or a poster for climate change, it really needs to be children and people, because we really care about our health more than anything else. And I think this is where the evidence is clear. We've been working on this for decades, that climate change, it's not just about the Arctic and about other remote species. It's about our own health. And I think that's where there may be more agreement and common ground when we all care about our children and our grandchildren, no matter what political stripe you wear. So I think that that's been very well documented, that it's about us. Climate change is about us. I point to one thing that came up when you talked about coronavirus. That one additional thing to recognize is that climate change may be connected to the front and back end of the coronavirus pandemic. On the front end, there are some studies that show changes in bat migration in Southeast Asia due to deforestation and also changes in climate. These need to be fleshed out further, but there is some issues about environmental destruction and changes in the host reservoir for that virus. On the back end, it's well documented that air pollution increases the risk of dying from COVID-19. So when we're burning coal and oil and warming the planet, we're also polluting our air and increasing the risk of dying from COVID. So there are more connections to burning fossil fuels and the COVID pandemic than I think most people realize. I think that the other thing that the pandemic has taught us is that, when faced with a global health crisis like this, that we are able to very quickly mobilize trillions of dollars. And we need to see climate change as the global health crisis that it is. And I'll just mention yesterday, the US National Academy of Medicine held its annual conference. The top two themes were COVID-19 and climate change. And the US National Academy is putting forward, they have launched a grand challenge addressing climate change, that this body, National Academy body, says climate change is our number one risk to health, and we need to move on it. So they've launched an action collaborative to decarbonize the U.S. healthcare sector, which represents about 8% of our emissions. So we need to lead from the front. I was surprised that Nick didn't brag about the incredible commitment that the UK National Health Service has made. They've pledged a net carbon zero emissions by the year 2040, and to achieve 80% of those emission reductions in the next 9 years by 2030. So the healthcare sector absolutely appreciates this as core to its mission to save lives, because climate change is a health emergency. And as Dr. Neira is leading efforts at the upcoming COP26, millions of health professionals, representation of millions of health professionals will be there and they are just calling for immediate action because of the health urgency.
Alexander Verbeek, how can governments mitigate the challenges of taking action on climate change when they're at the mercy of short-term election cycles? For example, in the United States, the U.S. joined the Paris Climate Agreement, and then President Trump was elected and pulled the U.S. out of it. And now we have another president who seems to have more of a commitment to climate change. How do governments manage thinking in long term when their own governments might change every few years?
Yeah, that's the typical problem. You always end up with all these things. You need long-term, good, sound policies, and with any political system you have in the world, whether it's a democracy that has, on average, let's say you're always, let's say, about 2 years away from the next elections, or whether it's a different system, it's always difficult to have this long-term investment because somebody else might get the credits of the investment you make now. So we need more. We need braver leaders. We need, let's say, the Winston Churchill type that is able to sell a difficult choice to make, to continue fighting a war instead of settling for peace, because you know that in the long term that is the best action that you need, and it's something that it's difficult to solve. I think one of the things that you need is to get support at ground level from the voters. So that needs a lot of education. That is a role for the media to really explain why this is a long-term change that we need to invest in now. You need to explain that it is cheaper now to make the changes instead of trying to solve the difficulties you will face afterwards. It's economically, it's a sound investment to make. And there's a lot of advantages. Many of them has been mentioned as well, from health benefits, etc. Another one is you will have a more peaceful world if you have less climate change, because climate change often leads to conflicts. It's another argument to use. So it's all of these things together. And one last remark here. Of course, we speak about all these positive things that you get from early climate action and who benefits from it. But there's also forces that stop us from taking action. And most notably, it's the fossil fuel industry that for decades has been investing huge amount of money in disinformation, even though they knew better than anybody else in the world how utterly damaging climate change was going to be and how many lives would be lost by the climate change that was created by the products that they were trying to sell. And they were providing this disinformation. They were saying that there was nothing wrong, that the scientists did not agree, only for their own profits. And it's personally, I think this is criminal behavior. If I'm in a cinema and I'm shouting there's a fire and people run out in a panic and people get hurt, I would be arrested. Or if there is a fire and I say there's not a fire, stay in the cinema, and that is exactly what these companies have been doing, that is criminal behavior on my account. And I believe if you do that on a global scale, consistently for decades, I think we have to look at those people that have been behind these policies.
Professor Keohane, I know you've been wanting to add something, so I'll let you jump in.
Thank you. I'll add something as a political scientist, a little bit different focus than Alexander's, who's focused on the persuasion and the messages. I think to get democracies to take a long-term policy stance, you need to build a coalition between the major political parties. So it's not an issue of party competition. So in the Cold War, the U.S. had a coalition of Democrats and Republicans were both in favor of a whole set of Cold War policies, which were long-term policies. Right now, the UK to its great credit, the EU and Norway are examples of countries where there's not party disagreement about climate change. There's a general view in all major political alignments that climate change is important. In the United States, in Canada, and Australia, where you have much less action and much less consistent action, you don't have that. So I think we need to build back the agreement among political elites that climate change is a policy we have to pursue regardless of who is in power, and not make it a subject of back and forth for turning on the policy and turning off the policy in arbitrary ways because of elections.
So when we look at economic costs of climate change, Professor, when should we listen to economists and pursue low-cost strategies, and when should we modify those strategies out of concern for politics?
A good question. Well, the economists are, of course, always saying, my son's one of these economists, that we need a price on carbon. And there's no question that that would be the most effective systemic approach to climate change. You put a price on carbon and you give people around the world incentives to reduce emissions, to save energy, to go to renewables. The problem is that a price on carbon is not always politically feasible. It's been feasible in some places like British Columbia, and it hasn't been very feasible in the United States, and not an explicit price on carbon. So then you have to go to a second best policy. So you listen to economists say, yes, we should push for that price on carbon, with allowances for people who are less wealthy, not imposing that tax on everybody equally, but making sure that there is a general price on carbon. However, that can't be done everywhere. The U.S. right now is not very promising. And so one then has to look for political strategies that are more popular. And that's what Biden is doing right now. Jobs, 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 they're saying. It's an infrastructure plan. It's a plan that's supposed to develop more jobs, more industry. That's a more popular alignment right now in the United States than a price on carbon. And so you have to go on both tracks. Keep your eye on the possibility of getting a price on carbon. In the long run, that's the most efficient way to act. But for the short run, do what's politically feasible to get some action going on a pressing, urgent basis.
Okay, Jonathan Patz, you had something to add?
Yeah, just a very quick comment. I was at a climate policy forum just 2 weeks ago, and a conservative representing Conservative Energy Forum said his argument was conservatives are very much into free market issue. They're not into government regulations. They're into free market. And this conservative individual, made the point that we are at a different place in time looking at the cost of energy, and that conservatives, everyone needs to recognize that the price of electricity, for example, is proven to be, if you remove all subsidies, renewables and batteries are now the cheapest. So if you take a conservative point of view and think about free market, and of course, as Dr. Neira pointed out, that the free market must include the external costs that are not in the market. When we burn fossil fuel, we pollute the air and we damage health. So there's the externalities of pollution. Absolutely, that needs to be in the free market. But even without that, simply the generation costs, we are in a different time, and that clean energy is now cheap. And it's not like we have to argue and wait for a solution to come. It's already here, and even conservatives can come on board with this.
Dr. Neira, I want to get back to the coronavirus pandemic because it's clear that climate change and health are intertwined, and it's not a matter of if, but when there's another pandemic. So I'm wondering, how has the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic been impacted by the climate crisis?
Well, first of all, of course, we have now the international community totally mobilized. I think everybody realized what the impact of such a pandemic can have on our economies, on our society. We are still struggling to get out of this crisis. We are still facing this issue of the lack of solidarity and equity on the distribution of the vaccines. We have been seeing very positive results on science, but still a lot of challenges and how to bring those science and then put those science where is much needed. I think if we are as humans now, as a society, if we are a minimum of intelligent, or we develop common sense approaches, we need to create an international system for pandemic preparedness and response. And I think these things are moving. We need to move in this concept of the One Health, where it's not just a human health, but it's human health, animal health, and very important, and this is probably the piece of the triangle that until now has been less considered, environmental health. And if we learn our lesson, we will invest very much in environmental health, because those are the causes of the causes that were creating this vulnerability, were responsible for creating this emergence of an infectious agent that soon could be another one. But I hope that in future we will be not just creating the best of the firefighters to be prepared to respond to an outbreak if it will happen again, but not only that, but looking as well as what put us on this situation, what we have been doing to nature, what we have been doing to our environment, our ecosystems, our biodiversity, how by destroying that, we were somehow affecting already our health. And if we are smart enough, I hope we will be moving the right direction. Probably the One Health will be one of the key lessons. But if you allow me, I would like to comment on this issue of depoliticizing the climate change debate, because I think it will be fundamental as well for the future. Until now, in many countries, there is still a kind of, if you are in favor to tackle the causes of climate change, you must be a so-called left wing, and if you are a conservator, you will be against. And I think that health can bring all of us on board in saying, well, this is not a question of a political party or a, whether you are left or right wing. Is a question of health and common sense. What I would love to see at the COP, instead of a planet, which is normally what it would represent, all of these COPs, if it's not that the polar bear will be a planet. I would love to see huge lungs at the entrance of the COP26 to remind people that this is one of the most affected ones, of course, in addition to many other organs. And that might be as well the way to generate these political actions that you were presenting before, saying that if the politicians, they have just the commitments on a very short term, how can we change that? If we give politicians if we equip them with good arguments, saying, well, by tackling and changing the way of you have at your city, you have your mobility.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then you will have votes. Your population will vote you, So we can, the politicians can win a lot of support on their elections if they use the health benefits that they have been obtaining by taking good decisions. Look at the tobacco. I will, if you allow me to be a little bit provocative, it will be great in each petrol station being able to put a tag. Anytime you go there and say, combustion of fossil fuels kills you, as we do for the tobacco. That is maybe a little bit extreme, but I think that will bring the health argument very strongly on all of these economic and political negotiations.
It certainly would be a stark reminder for people. Professor Keohane, I know that you do have to be leaving us shortly, so I wanted to get in one last question for you before you go. Climate change, of course, is global, but we live on a local level. What levels of action should we be emphasizing? Local, provincial, national, international?
I would say thank you very much for having me on this distinguished panel. I've learned a lot, and I thank you everybody else for your contributions. I think we agree, but we have had different emphasis, which is a nice feature of a panel. I think we have to act on every level. That's the obvious answer. We can't just choose one of them. The national level is the most important right now because, as Dr. Keohane said, we have to transfer political will into commitment, and that requires national policy action, not just setting targets, but actually doing things which implement the targets. But that has to be accompanied by international action, which makes it easier to do it. And the multilateralism, therefore, that Dr. Keohane and others have emphasized is very important because we can't expect countries to act on their own, especially if they're small and poor. We have to have a multilateral system which facilitates national action. So I think we have to focus on every country acting according to its own plans, its own interests, and doing more and more on climate change. We have to facilitate that from the top with international policies that make it feasible, and from the bottom, of course, by local level mobilization and political action that creates the conditions for that national action. So thank you very much for including me. I really appreciate it.
All right, Professor Robert Keohane from Princeton University, thank you so much for your time, and we'll let you go now. Dr. John and Keohane, I want to get back to you. In your opinion, as the director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, what factors had the most impact on the trajectory of the coronavirus pandemic in Africa?
I think the single most important action that will be required to shape the trajectory of this pandemic in Africa is rapid access to vaccines on the continent. It is not too late. We still have a window of opportunity to shape the future and the trajectory and avoid a catastrophe for all of us. Unfortunately, we spend more time looking at a response and mobilizing a tremendous amount of money to respond, but really spend little in preparedness. If we had, as a whole, contributed and paid a little bit of attention to preparedness, and preparedness at all levels, including access to vaccines, manufacturing, and diagnostics, we would have been in a better position to shape the future of this pandemic. I've always stated, and in public and in private, that the pandemic is unprecedented, but it was predictable. And we knew, but unfortunately, memory is short. If you see what happened with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where about 11,000 people died just 5 years ago, we said never again. And we wrote all kinds of guidelines, and we wrote all kinds of reports. But we didn't learn a lesson from that. I think you only learn a lesson from a scenario if you can actually use those, document it, and then use it to change the trajectory. What we did was a documentation of the scenario, what happened. My fear now is that we are also moving into that space now where we are all putting all kinds of panels together. They are coming out with reports, but I don't truly see anything concrete that is happening there. So I think if you ask my views, what is it the most singular important thing that needs to be done now is to mobilize rapid access to vaccine, vaccinate at speed, and vaccinate at scale on the continent.
Jonathan Patz, if the climate crisis is also a health crisis, what climate solutions can also work as solutions for the health crisis?
Well, the policies to address climate change are health policies because, when we look at energy and we look at energy policies to reduce carbon emissions, we're reducing air pollution that kills people. When we're looking at policies for urban planning and transportation to reduce carbon emissions, we're designing healthier cities, and that has huge benefits to reducing chronic diseases that are accelerating around the world. So absolutely, climate change energies to reduce the threat of more warming in themselves are health policies because they have health benefits. And likewise, the more we can reduce, every fraction of a degree we reduce potential rise of temperature is saving lives. So everything about climate change policy is health policy. And one more addition of Dr. Kangasong is just to mention, when we look at this pandemic, just like with climate change, we always want to move upstream. We don't want to be reactionary. We don't want to be just mopping up the floor and cleaning up the mess when we should be looking at turning off the faucet. And in this case, the faucet is fossil fuel emissions and deforestation regarding climate change. But for the pandemic aspect, and Dr. Maria Neira brought this up, that protecting ecosystems, these pandemics come from spilling over virus from wildlife. It's called zoonotic disease spillover. And the first domino that falls is destruction of the ecosystem that has those animals. And when you disrupt that, you disrupt their movement and their population and all that leads to an increased risk of disease. This has been documented in other bat-borne viruses. So key upstream, both for climate change and reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases that have a health benefit, but also as far as pandemics, ecosystem protection, conservation initiatives that we need to invest research in to understand which are the triggers, what are markers, early markers that may show disturbed ecosystems that may become a risk for the next pandemic. We need to move much more upstream and look at conservation as well as greenhouse gas emission reduction.
Alexander Verbeek, you mentioned earlier about how climate change leads to conflict. What are the major obstacles standing in the way of climate change being put at the top of the international security agenda?
Well, it is already discussed more and more in the UN Security Council, and you also see it in other security fora like NATO, for instance, is very active now on climate change. NATO is now in the midst of its review, its next policy towards, let's say, 2030. And the Secretary General personally is really pushing for having more the risks of climate change on board. In the UN Security Council, it is something new. Originally, the UN Security Council is about, let's say, traditional, conflicts between countries and solve that there. And so it's very geopolitical, and it is a relatively new thing. And Nick could have mentioned that if he would have still been here. It's a relatively new thing to have climate change on the agenda. It was the UK that in 2007 put it on the agenda, and then the Security Council was mainly debating whether or not they should be debating the impact of climate change on security. Now you see in the past 5-6 years or so, you see that increasingly climate change is on the agenda of the Security Council, mostly in a bigger format where all countries are actually present, but it is a Security Council meeting, and especially a group of countries where you find many from let's say Northwest Europe, but including countries from all over the world, are really pushing this on the agenda. But a few really big players in the Security Council amongst the P5 are only lukewarm to get this on the agenda. So I think it will ultimately get at the forefront for the very simple reason that conflicts in the world increasingly have the fingerprints of climate all over them. You see it, for instance, in the well-known example of the Arab Spring, and in the same time in the start of the conflict of Syria, where a prolonged drought played an important role, and also drought in other regions in the world, like in Russia and Australia and Kazakhstan. So food couldn't be delivered, and that gave that contributed to a lot of uprisings. You also see it in let's say the Sahel region, where you see increasing terrorist groups like Al Qaeda in the Maghreb rising because of the very bad conditions. It's never a direct link. You cannot say climate change caused a war, but you can say that climate change was in an already fragile situation, pushing the stakes so far that a conflict started that would otherwise have been either smaller or maybe not have started at all. So we'll definitely see more of this. It's just another reason, combined with all the health reasons we already mentioned, to be quick and efficient and dedicated on taking climate action on a worldwide scale. It has fantastic benefits, and a more peaceful world is just one of them.
A more peaceful world sounds wonderful. Dr. Neira, how has the threat perception of crises such as pandemics and climate-related events changed since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic? And how are these long-term threats of these types of events being incorporated into strategic outlooks? Oh, I think Dr. Neira, can you hear me? I think maybe we've lost our connection to Dr. Neira. So let's go to Dr. John Nkengasong, Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, while we try to get reestablished with Dr. Neira. Dr. Nkengasong, what do you think needs to be done for governments in wealthy countries to understand the threat posed by public health inequalities in Africa so that they're compelled to take action?
I think the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has done three things, I believe, to all of us. If you ask me what are some early lessons, they are the interconnectivity that we are as a human race. I think if you look at the trajectory of COVID-19, how it spread within 3 months, more than 165 countries had been affected. So it tells you how interconnected we are. The second thing this pandemic has taught us is how vulnerable we are. Regardless of where you live in the world, you are extremely vulnerable when we do not act together and act collectively. And thirdly is the gross inequalities that exist. So global health, for the first time in my mind, has meant something to everybody. Global health used to be seen like going to countries in the global south to address a health issue. But for the first time, I think we now know that the global health means all of us. It means truly global. So I think it should be relatively easy to articulate the concept of how much we are connected and what a disease threat anywhere can mean a disease threat everywhere within a very short space of time. I think that is clearly has to be articulated, not only at the political level, but at multiple layers down the society, to the extent that we absolutely need to know that addressing a threat in Africa, in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, that I'm speaking from, directly means that we are addressing that threat or preventing that from becoming a threat in the United Kingdom or the United States. I think COVID-19 has taught us that, and we should seize those lessons. But let me just end by saying that memory is short. And we said all the right things after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, but immediately that outbreak was out, we kind of lower our guards, and we are paying a price for that. COVID-19 probably is an indication that something even bigger and nasty will emerge in future. And if we do not address this appropriately and address it courageously and address it in a manner that it changes the fundamentals in the way that we address global health, my fear is that we will be surprised, and surprised not in the distant future, but almost in a short period of time.
Jonathan Patz, in terms of the future, do you see climate crises informing development and innovation in the global healthcare sector? And if so, how will the global healthcare sector be impacted by that?
Well, as I've mentioned, the healthcare sector is rapidly embracing this challenge. There's been a healthcare without harm movement for a long time that stepped in, and there are green hospitals all over. So there are concerns about being ready for disasters, and there are cases where hospitals have been in the path of forest fires, and the wildfire smoke has closed down hospitals very recently, and so that's a problem, as well as flooding. And so, number one, hospitals recognize they need to be resilient for the inevitable climate change. Even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels today, we're still committed to some amount of warming and more climate extremes. So there's that resilience aspect. But the other issue is to first, to not harm next generations as we're treating the current generation. So if hospitals recognize that they are very energy intensive, and that has to change, and places like Kaiser Permanente, which has a large chain of hospitals, other hospital groups around the world are stepping forward and committing to a low carbon future. So I hold up one more time the UK National Health Service and their incredible pledge, and they're really acting on it too, to go to net carbon zero by 2040, getting 80% there by the next 9 years. So the healthcare sector is really very concerned about the issue, trying to be responsible. The United States, under the Biden administration, has set up a brand new office of climate change, health equity under Health and Human Services. So seeing that priority is something that is new, and that climate change is now taking stage in the health sector as well as in the U.S. government as a top priority. And finally, issues back to COVID, which has absolutely laid bare the challenge of health inequity, and that this is something that we're taking seriously. I know the Biden administration in its plans are pledging for 40% benefits of any policy to be coming back to benefiting disadvantaged communities. So there's that recognition. And I think COVID has made that even clearer, the importance of dealing with health equity, or we're not going to have a solution that lasts very long at all. So lessons learned from COVID, and this is one where people are really taking seriously at all levels. So I'll just end with that.
And Alexander Verbeek, where does most of the power lie when it comes to countering climate change? Are we looking at governments, individuals, corporations?
All of the above. Everybody can make changes, but there's one that stands out, and that's governments. I mean, we don't get there. We don't solve this crisis without dedicated, brave governments that really dare to push this agenda forward, take the right decisions, take climate action, also grab the opportunities as they've been mentioned so often in this talk today. So I think governance is one of those essential issues that you always come back to when you talk about dealing with the climate crisis. I mean, another one would be looking at technology, but there I'm always very hopeful. I see the same with the pandemic, by the way. Technology was fantastic. It was amazing how fast a solution was found in the form of highly effective vaccines. It was the governance that deserves most attention, and the same is true with climate change. We have the knowledge how to solve it. We have the technology. We hardly even need more stuff. We already have everything. What we can do it economically, financially. It is not a problem either. We talk about huge costs, but it's much better to make these costs now. But the thing that's constantly blocking us from moving forward is
good governance, and especially all the governments in the world working together. Because, as was said earlier today, this is such a small planet. You just fly around it in 1 or 2 days. We are all connected. You see it in the spread of the virus, how fast it goes and how connected we are. And that's the same with climate change. It's something that we really need solidarity and international cooperation, and governments should step up that act. I already mentioned the example of the subsidies on meat and subsidies on fossil fuels. It's an absurd situation that we subsidize 20 times as more the thing that is killing us, that is harming our health, that is killing the planet, instead of the renewables that are the solution. Yes, government. Those are the 3 priorities of the list you mentioned. Not to say that at an individual level you shouldn't take action. Fly less, eat less meat, don't put the lights on in the rooms where you're not, insulate your house. All those kind of things are excellent to work on. Business should do its part. A lot of businesses are doing it. They're doing amazing things already, many businesses. But at the end of the day, it is good governance and international cooperation between all governments in the world, and a lot of solidarity that we need to solve this.
All right, and we are all out of time, so that is going to be the last word. That wraps up this panel discussion on climate and global health crises as strategic threats. Thank you again to my guests, Alexander Verbeek, Dr. Maria Neira, Dr. John Nkengasong, Jonathan Patz, and thank you for watching the TRT World Forum.